Total credit in the United States just hit $100 trillion. It's increased 100-fold in 60 years. That explosion of credit built our world. It finances all economic output, and it underpins the value of all of our assets. If credit now began to contract, the United States and the world would spiral down into a new Great Depression that our civilization would be unlikely to survive. This video, the seventh in the Creditism 101 series, will describe how a debt deflation depression would play out and the cataclysm it would produce. The objective of this video is to demonstrate that our economic system, creditism, will collapse if credit contracts, to explain that austerity in government spending is not an option because it would inevitably cause a catastrophic depression, and to show that large-scale government investment in the technologies of the future through a U.S. sovereign wealth fund, as recently endorsed by former President Trump and the Biden administration, is the surest path to a better and more prosperous future. Let's begin by looking at what happened last time. Starting with the outbreak of World War I in 1914 and continuing all through the 1920s, credit surged and a global credit bubble took shape. In 1930, the private sector became unable to repay all of its debt, and they began to default. Policymakers like President Herbert Hoover, believing laissez-faire to be the best policy approach, allowed market forces to play out, and they did. Between 1930 and 1933, 1/3 of all U.S. banks failed. As there was no deposit insurance then, countless Americans lost their savings at a time when there was no Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. Consumption, the largest component of GDP, crashed. Profitable companies became loss-making and went out of business. Those that survived drastically reduced new investment in their businesses and fired a large portion of their workforce. The unemployment rate climbed to 25% by August 1932 and was still there when Hoover left office in March 33. Real GDP contracted by 8.5% in 1930, by 6.4% in 1931, and then by 12.9% in 1932. In real terms, the size of the economy contracted by 26% between 1929 and 1933. The bottom dropped out from under prices. Prices fell 6.4% in 1930, 9.3% in 1931, and by 10.3% in 1932, making it much more difficult for people and businesses to earn enough money to repay their debts. Between 1929 and 1932, prices fell 24%. Nominal GDP collapsed by 12% in 1930, 16% in 1931, and 23% in 1932. Altogether, in nominal terms, the size of the economy contracted by 45% between 1929 and 1933. Government revenues collapsed in a depression. Between 1930 and 1933, government receipts fell by 53%. Government spending increased little in 1930 and 1931. The pickup in spending only came in 1932. Combining 1930 and 1931, the first 2 years of the collapse, there was a small budget surplus of 0.3% of GDP. There was a deficit of 4% of GDP in 1932 and 4.5% in 1933.